There's a document sitting in the National Archives right now. It's not classified anymore. You can read it. Anyone can. It has a date on it, signatures, official letterhead. It was written by people with real titles, generals, advisors, men who briefed presidents. And what it describes is so strange, so quietly unsettling, that most people who hear about it assume it must be fiction. It isn't. Operation Northwoods was a real proposal, written in 1962, approved through a chain of command that reached almost to the top. It suggested that the United States government could stage attacks on its own citizens, sink its own ships, shoot down its own planes, and then blame a foreign country for it. It was rejected, eventually. But the question that keeps coming back, the one nobody really answers cleanly, is how close did it get? There's something strange about reading a government document for the first time and realizing it says exactly what people told you it couldn't possibly say. Most of the time, when someone mentions a conspiracy, a real one, not the kind with blurry photographs and anonymous forums, there's a version of it that gets softened in the retelling. Details get rounded off, the edges get smoothed. By the time it reaches you, it sounds almost reasonable, almost explainable. You can fit it into a story you already understand. Northwoods doesn't do that. When you sit with the actual document and it exists, it's real, it's been scanned and archived and made publicly available, it doesn't feel softened at all. It feels very deliberate, very calm, written by people who believed they were being professional, who thought they were solving a problem. That's the part that takes a moment to absorb. It wasn't written in anger. It wasn't the product of some fringe group operating outside the system. It came from inside the system, from the highest levels of the American military in 1962, during one of the most anxious periods the country had ever lived through. To understand why the document exists at all, you have to go back to that moment. Not just the year, but the feeling of it. 1962 was not a comfortable time to be alive in America. The Cold War wasn't an abstraction. It was something people built bomb shelters for. School children were taught to crouch under their desks. Fallout maps were printed in newspapers. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and so did the United States. And the question of whether those weapons would ever be used wasn't treated as unthinkable. It was treated as a genuine possibility that responsible people needed to plan around. Cuba sat 90 miles off the coast of Florida. That detail mattered enormously. It still sounds almost too close when you say it out loud. 90 miles. On a clear day, people in Key West could see weather patterns moving in from the island. And since 1959, Cuba had been governed by Fidel Castro, who had aligned himself with the Soviet Union in ways that made Washington deeply, persistently uneasy. The Bay of Pigs invasion had happened in April of 1961. It was a disaster, a CIA-organized attempt to land Cuban exiles on the island and spark an uprising against Castro. It failed quickly and completely. The men who landed were captured. The operation became a source of national embarrassment, and more than that, a source of internal humiliation inside the government. People who had planned it, approved it, believed in it, they didn't stop believing that something needed to be done about Cuba. They just started believing it more urgently, with more frustration behind it. Kennedy was blamed, partly. The military felt he had pulled back air support at a critical moment. There was tension between the young president and the older generals, men who had commanded armies in the Second World War, men who thought in terms of decisive action and clear objectives. Kennedy had inherited this operation and then, in their view, hadn't committed to it fully. That tension matters because it's the atmosphere in which Northwoods was eventually conceived. By early 1962, a classified program called Operation Mongoose was already running. It was overseen by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, and it was aimed at destabilizing Cuba through sabotage, psychological operations, and various forms of covert pressure. It was a serious, well-funded effort. It involved hundreds of people, and it still didn't feel like enough to some of the men inside the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior military advisors to the president, were frustrated. They wanted a justification for direct military action, not covert operations, not sabotage runs in the dark. They wanted something that would allow the United States to openly, publicly move against Cuba. Something the American people would support. Something the international community couldn't easily criticize. And to create that justification, They were willing to consider something that most people, hearing it described today, assume must be exaggerated. They were willing to consider creating the justification themselves. The memo that would become known as Operation Northwoods was drafted in early 1962 by the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. It was addressed to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. It was titled, in the dry language of military bureaucracy, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it proposed in careful, methodical language that the United States government could stage a series of false flag events, incidents that would appear to be Cuban aggression against American targets, in order to build public and international support for a military invasion. The word false flag wasn't used in the document. The language was more neutral than that, but the meaning was clear. The proposal described events that would be designed to look like one thing while being another. Attacks that weren't attacks. Victims who might not be victims. Grief manufactured to serve a strategic purpose. It is a real document. That part is not in dispute. What stays with you, reading it slowly, is not the shock of it, though there is shock, quietly. What stays with you is the tone, the way it reads like a planning memo, like something someone brought to a meeting with coffee and a notepad. The way it assumes, throughout, that the people reading it will find this reasonable. That assumption is the thing that's hard to put down. There's a question that comes up naturally when you spend time with documents like this one. Not the dramatic question, not how could they or what were they thinking. Those questions answer themselves, more or less, once you understand the context. The question that's harder to sit with is quieter than that. It's simply, how normal did this feel to the people writing it? Because bureaucracies don't produce documents that feel radical to the people inside them. That's not how institutions work. People inside a system, any system, develop a shared language, a shared set of assumptions about what's acceptable to discuss, what's acceptable to propose. The borders of what feels reasonable shift gradually, over time, shaped by pressure and precedent and the particular anxieties of a given moment. In 1962, the particular anxiety was Cuba, and before that it was Korea, and before that the slow, exhausting weight of the Second World War. The men who drafted Northwoods had lived through all of it. They had watched cities burn. They had signed orders that sent thousands of men to die on beaches and in jungles. They had learned, through experience, that wars require justifications, and that justifications don't always arrive on their own. That history doesn't excuse the document, but it does explain something about the atmosphere in which it was written. The proposal itself was structured like a professional military assessment. It didn't begin with the most extreme suggestions. It opened with context, the strategic situation, the problem of Cuba, the need for a pretext that would satisfy both domestic and international audiences. It built its case methodically before arriving at what it was actually proposing. This is worth noting because it tells you something about how the document was intended to be read. It wasn't meant to shock, it was meant to persuade. Whoever drafted it expected the reader to follow the logic, step by step, and arrive at the same conclusion, that these measures were proportionate, necessary, professionally considered. Some of the proposals were relatively contained. Staged incidents near the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay, smoke, noise, the appearance of an attack without actual casualties, the kind of theatre that could be managed and controlled, but others were not contained at all. The document discussed the possibility of staging the destruction of an American ship, something reminiscent, deliberately, of the explosion of the USS Maine in 1898, which had helped push the United States into the Spanish-American War. That historical parallel wasn't subtle. Whoever wrote this knew their history. They were reaching back for a template. There were proposals involving civilian aircraft. The possibility of a drone plane, an unmanned aircraft being flown on a path that could be publicly announced as a civilian charter flight. If that drone were then destroyed, if wreckage were scattered, if a passenger list of fictitious names were released to the press, it would look, from the outside, like Cuba had shot down an American civilian plane. That proposal is the one most people stop on when they read the document for the first time. Not because it's the most extreme thing imaginable in an abstract sense, but because it's so specific. Because someone sat down and thought through the details, the flight path, the passenger list, the wreckage. Someone thought about how grief travels through a news cycle, how quickly a nation's mood can shift when there are names attached to a loss. And they wrote it down. The document also referenced the possibility of staged terrorism in American cities. Miami was mentioned, and Washington, events that could be blamed on Cuban agents, bombings, harassment, the sinking of Cuban refugee boats. Not real refugees, the language was careful about that, or tried to be, but the proposal existed, in writing, from within the United States government. It was presented to Robert McNamara in March of 1962. What happened after that, the rejection, the quiet burial, the 30 years of silence, belongs to the chapters ahead. But it's worth staying here for a moment, in the plain fact of the document's existence, before moving forward. Because there's a version of history that most of us carry around without examining it too closely. A version where the institutions we grew up with, the military, the government, the structures that are supposed to protect people operated within certain limits. Not perfectly, not without failure or corruption or error, but within limits. Northwoods doesn't destroy that version entirely. One document isn't the whole of anything, but it does quietly revise it. It adds a detail that's hard to unsee. It shows that at a specific moment in time, inside a real institution, a group of serious and credentialed men looked at the idea of staging violence against American civilians and brought it forward as a professional recommendation. They didn't do it in secret exactly. They did it through channels. They signed their names. That's the detail that tends to stay with people. Not the content of the proposals, disturbing as that is, but the casualness of the process, the way it moved through normal bureaucratic steps. The signatures at the bottom of the page, written in ink, by men who went home that evening and had dinner, and probably slept fine. The document exists. It has always existed, even during the decades when almost no one knew to look for it. And that quiet fact that it was there, waiting, filed away, is where this story really begins. There's a tendency, when you encounter something like Northwoods, to reach for a simple explanation, to decide that the people behind it must have been extreme in some obvious way, outliers, fanatics, operating at the fringes of an otherwise reasonable system. It's a comforting frame because it keeps the document at a distance. It makes it an exception rather than a product. But the men who signed it weren't outliers. That's the uncomfortable part. General Lyman Lemnitzer, whose signature appears on the document, was by any conventional measure a distinguished and accomplished military figure. He had served in the Second World War with genuine distinction. He had been involved in the negotiations that led to the surrender of German forces in Italy. After the war, he rose steadily through the ranks, eventually becoming Army Chief of Staff and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military advisory position in the United States. He was not a marginal figure. He was not someone operating outside the system. He was, in the early 1960s, one of the most powerful military men in the country. The other members of the Joint Chiefs who reviewed and supported Northwoods were similarly credentialed. These were men who had commanded forces in major conflicts, who had spent decades navigating the most complex institutional environment in the world, who understood professionally, deeply the consequences of military action. They weren't naive about what war meant. They had seen it. So the question isn't whether these men were competent or serious. They clearly were both. The question is something more specific than that. It's about what kind of thinking becomes possible inside a particular institutional culture, under a particular kind of pressure, at a particular moment in history. The Pentagon in the early 1960s had a specific character. It was shaped, more than anything else, by the experience of the Second World War and by the anxiety of the nuclear age that followed it. The men who ran it had come of age in a world where the stakes of military conflict were absolute, where losing meant occupation, subjugation, the end of things. That experience produced a certain kind of mind, decisive, unsentimental about cost, convinced that the worst outcomes were always possible and that preparation for them was not paranoia but responsibility. The Cold War fed directly into that mindset. The Soviet Union was not a hypothetical threat, it was a real adversary with real nuclear weapons and a stated ideological commitment to the expansion of communism. Cuba, after 1959, represented something specific within that broader anxiety. A Soviet, aligned government 90 miles from American soil, led by a man who had just humiliated the United States in front of the world. The Bay of Pigs failure hadn't made Castro seem less dangerous. If anything, it had made him seem more entrenched, more confident, more symbolic of American weakness. Inside the Pentagon, this was not an abstract frustration, it was personal in a way. The military felt that Kennedy had mishandled the Bay of Pigs, that he had authorized an operation and then failed to provide the air cover that might have made it succeed. There are accounts from that period of genuine anger in military circles. Not the kind of anger that gets expressed loudly in public, but the quieter, more dangerous kind that hardens into institutional resentment. Lemnitzer, by several accounts, had a particularly strained relationship with Kennedy. He found the young president insufficiently decisive. Kennedy, for his part, was reportedly unsettled by Lemnitzer, by what he perceived as an almost casual willingness to consider nuclear options in strategic planning sessions. There's a well-documented moment during this period, separate from Northwoods entirely, where Kennedy walked out of a national security meeting and expressed disbelief at what he had just heard being discussed by his military advisors. The culture that produced Northwoods was one in which certain calculations had become normalized. The idea that deception was a legitimate tool of statecraft that wasn't new, and it wasn't unique to the American military. Every major power in the 20th century had used deception in wartime. False flag operations had existed for centuries. The specific history of covert American operations after the Second World War, the establishment of the CIA, the various interventions in Iran, Guatemala, and elsewhere had built up a kind of institutional vocabulary around this kind of thinking. Operations that were not what they appeared to be had been planned, executed, and in some cases considered successful. What Northwoods did was apply that vocabulary to a domestic context in a particularly explicit way. The proposals weren't just about deceiving foreign governments or international observers. Some of them were about deceiving the American public, about manufacturing the emotional and political conditions, grief, outrage, fear that would make military action feel not just acceptable, but necessary. That's the line the document crossed that's hardest to explain away. And yet, the men who crossed it didn't seem to experience it as crossing a line. The tone of the document doesn't suggest internal conflict. It doesn't read like something written by people who knew they were proposing something wrong. It reads like a professional assessment, a solution to a problem. That tells you something about where the line actually sat inside that institution at that moment. Not where we might assume it was, not where it perhaps should have been, but somewhere further along than most people would find comfortable to acknowledge. There's also the matter of what these men knew from their own recent history. Covert operations and manufactured pretexts were not hypothetical to them. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which would be used to justify massive escalation in Vietnam, was still 2 years away, but the thinking that produced it existed already. There were people in positions of authority who genuinely believed that the public needed to be managed, that democratic populations couldn't always be trusted with the full complexity of strategic decisions, that leaders sometimes had to create the conditions for necessary action, rather than wait for those conditions to arrive organically. This is not a fringe belief in the history of statecraft. It has a long lineage. It sits uncomfortably at the intersection of genuine strategic thinking and something that most people would, without hesitation, call manipulation. Lemnitzer was removed from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs later in 1962. Kennedy did not reappoint him. He was reassigned to command NATO forces in Europe, which was a significant posting, but represented a clear sidelining from the center of American military decision-making. Whether this was directly connected to Northwoods or part of the broader deterioration of the relationship between Kennedy and his military leadership is something historians have discussed without reaching a clean conclusion. What is clear is that Lemnitzer never publicly addressed Northwoods, not during his lifetime, not in memoirs or interviews. The document surfaced decades after his death, in the context of a broad declassification effort that he never anticipated or had reason to prepare for. The other men who reviewed the proposal also left no public record of their thoughts on it, no reflections, no second-guessing. Either they considered it a routine part of their work, which is disturbing in its own way, or they understood on some level that it was better left unexamined. What remains is the document itself, the signatures, the institutional letterhead, the careful, professional language wrapping around proposals that most people, reading them for the first time, have to read twice to fully accept as real. These were not monsters, in any simple sense of the word. They were products of a system, a moment, a set of assumptions about power and necessity, and acceptable cost. That framing doesn't absolve them. But it does raise a question that's harder to dismiss than outrage alone would allow. If the system produced these men, and these men produced this document, then what does that say about the system? Not just in 1962, but in the broader sense. About what institutions are capable of, quietly, when the pressure is high enough and the oversight is thin enough and the culture has drifted far enough from the people it was built to serve. That question doesn't have a clean answer. It probably shouldn't. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from reading something that should feel shocking, but is written as though it isn't. Legal documents do this sometimes. Medical reports, military assessments. The language stays flat and procedural, regardless of what the content actually describes, and that flatness creates a strange distance between the words and their meaning. You have to slow down and translate as you go. You have to remind yourself what you're actually reading about. The Northwoods document is like that. It runs to several pages. It's organized logically. It uses phrases like "could be utilized" and "it is recommended," and "the following suggestions are forwarded." The grammar is careful. The tone is measured. And embedded within that measured tone are proposals that, if you encountered them in a novel, you might set the book down and decide the author had gone too far. But it isn't a novel. The document opens by establishing context which, as discussed, was the frustration following the Bay of Pigs and the ongoing pressure to find a justification for direct military action against Cuba. It frames the problem clearly. The United States needs a pretext. Something that will hold up to international scrutiny. Something that will shift public opinion decisively. The memo then proceeds to offer solutions to that problem, organized into categories, moving from the more contained to the more consequential. The first cluster of proposals centered on the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which the United States has maintained on Cuban soil under a lease that predates Castro's government. Guantanamo was useful for this kind of planning because it represented an existing point of contact, a place where American and Cuban interests already existed in proximity, where incidents could plausibly occur. The proposals involving Guantanamo included staging an attack on the base, not a real attack, a simulated one. Friendly Cubans, the document suggested, could be used to dress in Cuban military uniforms and appear to assault the perimeter of the base. Ammunition would be expended. There would be noise and smoke, and the appearance of violence. The base commander would report the attack through official channels. It would enter the record as a Cuban act of aggression. There was also a proposal to blow up a ship inside Guantanamo Harbor, an American vessel, and blame Cuban saboteurs. The memo noted that this could be done in a way that minimized real casualties, though it didn't rule out casualties entirely. The language around this point is careful in a way that makes it more troubling rather than less. It doesn't say no one will be hurt. It says the operation could be conducted so that casualties would be kept low. The distinction matters. Another proposal suggested that Cuban aircraft could appear to attack an American plane in international airspace. This would be staged using American military aircraft. One would simulate being under attack, transmit a distress call, and then the incident would be reported as an act of Cuban aggression. No plane would actually be shot down, no pilot would actually be in danger, but the event would enter the public record as real. These first proposals are disturbing, but they operate within a certain range. They involve military assets, military personnel, controlled environments. There's a logic to them. Even if the logic is deeply troubling, the risk of real harm is limited. The deception is aimed at foreign and domestic audiences rather than at specific identifiable civilians. Then the document moves further. There are proposals about harassment of Cuban refugees staging incidents in which Cuban exiles fleeing the island would be attacked at sea, and the attacks blamed on Castro's government. The document describes this in terms of the political effect. The image of refugees being targeted would generate outrage and sympathy in the United States and internationally. It would make Castro look brutal. It would make intervention look humanitarian. The people in those boats were real. Cuban exiles were regularly attempting to cross to Florida during this period. They were already in danger from the sea crossing itself. The proposal, as written, treated that existing vulnerability as an asset, something that could be shaped and directed to serve a strategic purpose. That's a different category of proposal than staging smoke and noise at a military base. And then there is the drone aircraft proposal, which is the one that tends to stop people completely when they encounter it. The document describes the possibility of developing a civilian charter flight, a plane with a published flight plan, carrying a passenger manifest of invented names, real people with college student identifications, the memo suggests, names that could be confirmed if anyone checked. This plane, in the proposal, would not actually carry civilian passengers. It would be a military aircraft disguised as a civilian one, or it would be a drone, an unmanned aircraft flying the designated route, while a real civilian plane, carrying the actual passengers assigned to that flight, quietly diverted elsewhere. The drone would then be shot down or would appear to be shot down over Cuban airspace or near it. The wreckage would fall. A passenger list would be released to the press. The story would be that Cuba had destroyed an American civilian aircraft, killing everyone aboard. The names on the list would belong to people who were actually alive, quietly redirected somewhere else, their existence unknown to the public, grieving their deaths. The proposal also mentioned the possibility of a real aircraft being used with real passengers. The language at this point becomes slightly more ambiguous, and that ambiguity has been the subject of debate among historians. Some read it as suggesting that real casualties were being seriously considered. Others argue the intent was always for the passenger version to be a cover that the actual aircraft carrying people would always divert safely. The document doesn't resolve this clearly. And that lack of clarity is its own kind of answer about how seriously the drafters were thinking through the human cost. There were also proposals concerning American cities. Miami and Washington were both mentioned. The memo described the possibility of staging acts of terrorism in those cities' bombings, the sinking of boats, violent incidents that could be attributed to Cuban agents operating on American soil. The political purpose was clear. If Americans believed Cuba was attacking them at home, the pressure for military response would become overwhelming. Public opinion would not need to be persuaded. It would arrive fully formed, shaped by fear and grief, and the very human desire for something to be done. The document doesn't describe exactly how these urban incidents would be staged. It doesn't go into operational detail at that level, which means either the details were left for later planning stages, or the drafters understood that the concept was what needed approval first, the specifics could follow. Both of those possibilities are uncomfortable in their own way. Reading through the full proposal, there's a pattern that becomes visible after a while. Each suggestion is calibrated, or attempts to be, to produce a specific emotional and political effect. The Guantanamo incidents would establish Cuban aggression in a military context. The refugee attacks would generate humanitarian outrage. The civilian aircraft would produce grief and shock on a national scale. The urban terrorism would create fear at home, the sense of being attacked on one's own ground. Taken together, the proposals form something like a comprehensive emotional architecture, a designed sequence of manufactured experiences meant to move a population from its current position, reluctant to support another military action after the Bay of Pigs, embarrassment to a position of demanding one. It is, in a cold and clinical way, a sophisticated piece of work. The people who drafted it understood how public opinion moves. They understood the emotional triggers that shift populations. They understood that facts alone don't drive nations to war, feelings do, and they were willing to manufacture those feelings. That sophistication is part of what makes the document so difficult to simply file away as the product of extremism or incompetence. This wasn't sloppy thinking. It was careful thinking applied to something most people would consider deeply wrong. There's one more detail worth sitting with before moving forward. The memo, near its conclusion, addresses the question of plausibility. It acknowledges that some of the proposals would need to be managed carefully to avoid detection. It suggests that certain operations be primarily Cuban in appearance, meaning that any visible participants should appear to be Cuban nationals, not American military or intelligence personnel. In other words, the document acknowledges that the operations would need to be hidden not just from the public and from international observers, but from the normal processes of American government itself. The deception wasn't just external, it was internal. The proposal assumed that people within the American system, journalists, investigators, members of Congress, ordinary citizens, would need to be fooled as thoroughly as anyone else. That assumption reveals something. It shows that the people drafting this proposal understood, on some level, that what they were describing would not survive scrutiny, that if it were known, really known, not just classified but publicly understood, it would not be acceptable. They knew that, and they wrote it down anyway. Something about Cuba got under Washington's skin in a way that's hard to fully explain through strategy alone. Strategically, Cuba was a small island with a limited military and an economy that had been significantly disrupted by revolution. It wasn't the Soviet Union. It wasn't China. By any objective measure of national power, it wasn't in the same category as the threats the United States was managing elsewhere in the world during the early 1960s. And yet the amount of attention, resources, anxiety, and institutional energy that Washington directed toward Cuba during this period was extraordinary, almost disproportionate when you look at it from a distance. To understand Northwoods, you have to understand that disproportionality, because the document didn't emerge from a calm strategic calculation. It emerged from something closer to obsession, and obsessions, in governments, as in people, tend to produce thinking that wouldn't survive in a cooler atmosphere. Cuba, before 1959, was a complicated place. It was nominally independent, but functioned in many practical ways as an American client state. American corporations owned significant portions of the island's agricultural land and industry. American tourists filled its hotels. The Batista government, brutal and corrupt by most accounts, including American ones, was tolerated because it was stable and friendly to American interests. The relationship was transactional in a way that both governments understood, even if neither said it plainly. When Castro's forces came down from the Sierra Maestra Mountains and Batista fled in January of 1959, the initial American reaction wasn't panic. Castro wasn't immediately understood as a communist. There was a period, brief but real, when some American officials thought a working relationship might be possible. Castro visited the United States in April of 1959. He met with Vice President Nixon. The meeting did not go well, by Nixon's account. Castro was not interested in the kind of relationship Washington was offering. What followed was a deterioration that fed on itself. American hostility pushed Cuba toward the Soviet Union. Cuban alignment with the Soviet Union deepened American hostility. Economic sanctions made Cuba more dependent on Soviet support. Soviet support made American policymakers more alarmed. By 1960, the CIA was already planning what would become the Bay of Pigs operation, and the relationship had passed whatever point of return it might once have had. The Bay of Pigs, when it happened in April of 1961, was a failure on almost every level. The Cuban exiles who landed at the Bay of Pigs were captured within days. The expected popular uprising against Castro didn't materialize. The CIA's assumptions about Cuban public sentiment turned out to be badly wrong, and Kennedy's decision to withhold the air support that the operations planners had considered essential meant that the exiles were left exposed without the cover they needed. 1,100 men were captured. They would eventually be ransomed back to the United States in exchange for food and medicine, a transaction that itself felt humiliating to many in Washington. A confirmation that Castro had won a confrontation with the most powerful country in the world and emerged not just intact, but strengthened. Castro understood the symbolic value of this. He was a skilled political communicator, and he used the Bay of Pigs extensively as evidence that Cuba could resist American pressure, as a rallying point for Cuban nationalism, as a demonstration to other countries in Latin America and beyond that the United States was not invincible. The failure didn't just leave Castro in power, it arguably made him more powerful than he had been before. Inside Washington, the response was a kind of controlled fury. Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility for the failure, a move that was politically graceful but did nothing to reduce the internal pressure to do something. The Joint Chiefs were frustrated, the CIA was embarrassed, and the Kennedy administration, caught between its public posture of restraint and its private conviction that Castro needed to be dealt with, authorized a program that would attempt to accomplish, through covert means, what the Bay of Pigs had failed to accomplish through force. Operation Mongoose was the result. It was formally authorized in late 1961 and ran through 1962. Robert Kennedy oversaw it with an intensity that reportedly made even some of the CIA officers involved uncomfortable. The program included sabotage operations against Cuban infrastructure, sugar mills, oil facilities, transportation networks. It involved propaganda efforts aimed at the Cuban population. It supported Cuban exile groups conducting raids on the island. And it included, though this would not become fully public for decades, a series of assassination plots against Castro himself. The assassination attempts are documented now. They were investigated by the Church Committee in the 1970s and entered the public record. The methods considered, and in some cases attempted, ranged from the straightforward to the genuinely bizarre poisoned cigars, an exploding seashell placed in a location where Castro liked to dive, a contaminated diving suit. A collaboration with organized crime figures who had their own reasons for wanting Castro gone, the mob, had lost lucrative casino operations when Castro nationalized them. These weren't fringe ideas. They were seriously considered, and in some cases seriously attempted by the American intelligence apparatus. None of them worked. Castro survived every attempt, partly through luck, partly through an intelligence apparatus that was apparently quite good at identifying threats, and partly because the logistical complexity of killing a head of state, who was aware that people were trying to kill him, turned out to be greater than the planners anticipated. The failure of Mongoose to produce results, combined with the ongoing humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, combined with the broader Cold War anxiety about Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere, is the atmosphere in which Northwoods was drafted. It's important to hold all of that together when reading the document. It wasn't conceived in a vacuum. It was conceived by people who felt they had already tried the more restrained options and found them insufficient. There's a psychological dimension to this that's worth acknowledging. When institutions fail at something, and then fail again, and the pressure to succeed doesn't diminish, the range of options that start to seem acceptable tends to expand. Not because the people involved have become worse people, but because the frame of reference shifts. What felt extreme before the first failure feels less extreme after the second. The baseline moves. This is a documented pattern in organizational psychology, and it doesn't require bad intentions to operate. It just requires pressure, repeated failure, and a culture that values results over the means of achieving them. The Joint Chiefs existed inside exactly that kind of culture. They had watched the Bay of Pigs fail. They had watched Mongoose produce inconclusive results. They had sat in meetings where the urgency of the Cuba problem was emphasized repeatedly, without any of the proposed solutions proving adequate. And they had developed, gradually, a conviction that what was needed was not a better covert operation, but a different kind of action, entirely something overt, something military, something decisive. For that, they needed justification, and they had concluded that if justification wasn't going to arrive on its own, it could be constructed. The specific historical precedents they drew on are visible in the document itself. The USS Maine, the American battleship that exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, killing more than 200 sailors and providing the emotional catalyst for the Spanish-American War, is referenced explicitly. The circumstances of the Maine's explosion were never definitively established. Early investigations blamed a Spanish mine. Later analysis has suggested the explosion may have been internal, possibly accidental. But in 1898, the American press and public didn't wait for definitive analysis. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry. War followed. The drafters of Northwoods knew this history. They were reaching for it deliberately. They wanted a Maine moment, an event that would produce the same emotional and political effect, the same rapid shift in public mood from reluctance to demand. And they were willing to manufacture one because they didn't think a real one was coming. What's striking, looking at this from a distance, is how thoroughly the Cuba obsession had narrowed the field of vision inside certain parts of the American government. The question of whether military action against Cuba was actually the right strategic choice, whether it would achieve lasting results, whether it would destabilize the region in ways that created new problems, whether it would hand the Soviet Union a propaganda victory of its own, these questions were not absent from the broader policy conversation. There were voices, including within the administration, that argued for a different approach, but inside the Pentagon, inside the specific culture that produced Northwoods, those questions had been largely set aside. The assumption was that Cuba needed to be dealt with militarily. The only problem was the pretext. And if the pretext could be manufactured, the problem was solved. That narrowing the way an institution can become so focused on a particular goal that the means of achieving it stop receiving the scrutiny they deserve is one of the most important things the Northwoods document illustrates, not as a historical curiosity, but as a dynamic that doesn't belong exclusively to 1962 or to any particular government. Institutions under pressure, pursuing goals they've decided are necessary, with cultures that reward results and discourage dissent. These conditions exist in many places and many times. The Cuba obsession was specific. The conditions that made Northwoods possible are less so. Castro, for his part, outlasted everyone involved in these plans. He outlasted Kennedy, McNamara, Lemnitzer, and most of the CIA officers who spent years trying to remove him. He lived until 2016, more than 5 decades after Northwoods was drafted. Whether he ever learned the specific details of the proposal is unclear. He certainly knew, in general terms, that the United States had considered and attempted extraordinary measures against him. He said so publicly many times, though his claims were often dismissed in the American press as propaganda. Some of what he claimed turned out, eventually, to be documented fact. That's a quiet irony that sits at the edge of this story without quite resolving into anything clean. The man the proposals were designed to remove died in his own bed, at 90 years old, in the country he had governed for nearly 6 decades. The document designed to end his rule sat in an archive for 30 years, unknown to almost everyone. History doesn't always arrange itself into satisfying shapes. There's a version of this story where the rejection of Northwoods is the reassuring part, where Robert McNamara reads the proposal, recognizes it for what it is, and the system works the way it's supposed to work. A dangerous idea reaches the right person at the right moment, and that person says no, and the danger passes. That version is partially true. McNamara did reject it. Kennedy rejected it. The operation was never carried out. In the most literal sense, the safeguard held. But the more time you spend with the details of that rejection, the less reassuring it becomes. Not because the rejection wasn't real, it was, But because of what it reveals about why the rejection happened, and what that implies about what might have happened under slightly different circumstances, Robert McNamara is one of the more complex figures in 20th century American history. He came to the Defense Department from the Ford Motor Company, where he had been president, a businessman, a systems analyst, someone who believed deeply in the application of rigorous quantitative thinking to large organizational problems. He was brilliant in a specific and somewhat narrow way. He trusted data. He trusted process. He had a quality of self-assurance that people who worked with him described variously as confidence and arrogance, often depending on whether they agreed with him. He would later become one of the principal architects of American escalation in Vietnam, a fact that complicates any simple narrative about him as the man who stopped Northwoods, the same McNamara who rejected a proposal to stage false flag attacks on American civilians, would oversee a war effort that, by most serious historical accounts, was sustained long past the point where the people running it believed it could be won. His memoirs, published decades later, were remarkable partly for the extent to which he acknowledged his own failures, an acknowledgement that came too late to mean much to the people who died in that war. But in March of 1962, McNamara received the Northwoods proposal and rejected it. The exact nature of that rejection, what McNamara said, what Kennedy said, what conversations happened in which rooms is not fully documented in the public record. What is known is that Kennedy met with Lemnitzer shortly after the proposal was submitted, and that the meeting did not go well for Lemnitzer. Kennedy's reaction to the document was, by the accounts that exist, one of cold displeasure. He was not someone who expressed outrage theatrically, but people who knew him described a particular quality of stillness that indicated serious anger, and that quality was reportedly present after he reviewed what his Joint Chiefs had sent him. Lemnitzer was not reappointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs when his term ended later that year. He was reassigned to NATO. The administration's public explanation was routine term endings, rotation of personnel, nothing unusual. Whether the Northwoods proposal was a direct factor in that decision is something historians have debated. The timing is suggestive. The lack of documentation makes certainty impossible. What's worth examining is the question of why the proposal was rejected, because there are at least two very different kinds of rejection, and they lead to very different conclusions about the system that produced the document. The first kind of rejection is moral. The proposal was rejected because the people who reviewed it recognized it as wrong, not just strategically risky, but ethically unacceptable. Because staging attacks on American civilians, manufacturing grief, deceiving the public, these things violated principles that the administration held as genuine commitments, not just public positions. The second kind of rejection is practical. The proposal was rejected because it was too risky, because the chances of exposure were too high, because the political consequences of discovery would be catastrophic, because the operational complexity made success uncertain, because the timing was wrong, or the method was wrong, or the specific circumstances didn't favor it. These two kinds of rejection look similar from the outside. In both cases, the answer is no, but they imply very different things about the institution and the people inside it. A moral rejection says, "We would not do this under any circumstances because it is wrong." A practical rejection says, "We would not do this under these circumstances because it is risky." The documentary record doesn't clearly establish which kind of rejection this was, and that ambiguity is significant. There are reasons to believe elements of both were present. Kennedy was not without moral convictions. He had genuine concerns about the militarization of American foreign policy, about the creeping expansion of what the national security apparatus considered acceptable. His American University speech, delivered the following year in 1963, is one of the more remarkable foreign policy addresses ever given by an American president a genuine call for restraint, for empathy toward adversaries, for a recognition that the Soviet Union was populated by human beings who had suffered enormously and deserved something better than annihilation. That speech suggests a man capable of genuine moral reasoning about these questions, not just strategic calculation. But Kennedy was also a politician in a specific and pressured environment. He was managing an administration that had already suffered one major public failure in Cuba. He was aware that he was perceived by some in the military as insufficiently tough, insufficiently decisive. He was not in a position to simply dismiss his Joint Chiefs' concerns about Cuba, even if he found their proposed solutions unacceptable. The rejection of Northwoods didn't mean the pressure that produced it went away. And McNamara, the man who actually received the document first and sent it back, left even less of a record about his reasoning. In the decades of interviews and memoirs and retrospective assessments that followed his time in government, he addressed many aspects of his tenure at the Defense Department in considerable detail. Northwoods was not among them. Whether this was because he considered it a minor episode, or because he preferred not to revisit it, or for some other reason entirely, he never said. The silence around the rejection is almost as interesting as the rejection itself. There's also the question of what the rejection meant for the people who drafted the proposal. Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs received their answer. Through channels the proposal was returned, not approved, and Lemnitzer's relationship with the administration continued its deterioration. But there's no record of anyone being formally reprimanded, investigated, or sanctioned for having drafted and submitted a proposal to stage attacks on American civilians. Think about what that means for a moment. A document was created, signed, and submitted through official channels, proposing that the United States government manufacture terrorist incidents on American soil and shoot down an aircraft with a fake passenger manifest. That document was rejected. And then, apparently, life went on. The men who signed it continued in their positions at least for a time. No investigation was opened. No formal censure was issued. The proposal was simply not approved and then quietly set aside. That response or absence of response tells you something about the institutional culture. It suggests that what had been proposed, however unacceptable to the administration, was not viewed as the kind of thing that required a response beyond a simple no. It was treated as a proposal that went too far, not as a proposal that should never have been made. The distinction matters, because an institution that treats unacceptable proposals as simply unsuccessful ones rather than as symptoms of something that needs to be examined and corrected is an institution that has not actually resolved the underlying problem. It has only declined a specific request. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, less than 2 years after Northwoods was rejected. The circumstances of his assassination have been debated continuously since the moment it happened, and that debate has generated more heat than light over the decades. Northwoods is sometimes drawn into those debates, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly. The existence of the document is cited as evidence that forces within the American government were capable of extreme action, which is true. Whether any such forces were involved in Dallas is a different question entirely, one that the Northwoods document alone cannot answer. What the document does establish, cleanly and without requiring any speculation, is that in 1962, a serious proposal for state-sponsored deception and violence against American citizens and interests reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense through normal bureaucratic channels, and that it was rejected quietly, without significant consequence for those who proposed it. McNamara lived until 2009. He was 93 years old when he died. In the last years of his life, he gave extensive interviews and cooperated with documentary filmmakers in ways that suggested a man genuinely wrestling with the consequences of decisions he had made. The Fog of War, the Errol Morris documentary from 2003, is one of the more extraordinary documents of that late life, reckoning a film in which McNamara reflects on Vietnam, on Cuba, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the nature of rationality and its limits in the context of war. He doesn't mention Northwoods in that film. He doesn't mention it in the book that accompanied it. He doesn't mention it in the other interviews and retrospectives from that period. Maybe it truly seemed minor to him in the context of everything else he had been through. Maybe it was one document among thousands, one rejected proposal among many, and the weight it carries now after decades of public discussion wasn't weight he ever assigned to it personally. Or maybe it was something he preferred to let stay where it had been for so long. In an archive, quiet, waiting for someone to find it. There's a tendency, when a dangerous idea gets rejected, to treat the rejection as the end of the story. The proposal failed. The safeguard worked. We can move on. But institutions don't work that way. When a specific proposal is rejected, the pressure that generated it doesn't disappear. It redistributes. It finds other channels, other forms, other proposals that accomplish something adjacent to what was refused. The goal doesn't go away just because one path to it was closed. Northwoods was rejected in March of 1962. The Cuba problem, as Washington understood it, remained entirely intact, and the operations that continued, the ones that were approved, funded, and carried out, tell a story that sits in uncomfortable proximity to the one that wasn't. Operation Mongoose is the place to start, because it was already running when Northwoods was submitted, and it continued running after Northwoods was rejected. It was the Kennedy administration's primary covert action program against Cuba, and its scope was broader than most Americans knew at the time or know now. The program was overseen by Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a counterinsurgency specialist with a history of unconventional operations in the Philippines and Vietnam. He reported to a committee that included Robert Kennedy, the CIA director, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other senior officials. The organizational structure was serious and well-resourced. This was not a fringe effort. It was a central priority of the administration. Mongoose involved multiple tracks operating simultaneously. There was a sabotage track. CIA-trained Cuban exiles conducting raids on Cuban infrastructure, targeting sugar mills, oil refineries, transportation links. The goal was economic disruption, the erosion of the Cuban government's capacity to function, the creation of conditions that might generate internal opposition to Castro. These raids happened. They were real operations with real participants who took real risks. There was an intelligence track, the development of networks inside Cuba, the recruitment of informants, the collection of information about the Cuban military and government. This was standard intelligence work, though conducted under significant pressure to produce actionable results quickly. And there was the assassination track. The CIA's attempts to assassinate Castro are now part of the documented historical record. The Church Committee, a Senate investigation that ran through 1975 and 1976, examined these programs in considerable detail and produced a public report that named names, described methods, and established a factual record that had previously existed only in classified files and rumor. The assassination plots were numerous and, in some cases, almost unbelievably strange. There was a plan to contaminate Castro's cigars with a substance that would cause his beard to fall out, the theory being that his beard was central to his public image and its loss would humiliate him. This plan was apparently seriously considered. There was a plot involving a poisoned wetsuit, intended to be given to Castro as a gift through an intermediary. There were multiple attempts involving poison pills delivered through various channels. There was the collaboration with organized crime figures, specifically with mobsters who had operated casinos in pre-revolutionary Cuba and had strong financial and personal motivations for wanting Castro removed. The mob connection is worth pausing on, because it illustrates something important about how the boundaries of acceptable action had shifted inside the American government by this period. The CIA was actively coordinating with organized crime figures, men who were simultaneously under investigation by the FBI, the same Justice Department that Robert Kennedy was running with his own anti-organized crime agenda. The right hand and the left hand were not only not coordinating, they were actively working at cross purposes. The CIA was enlisting people that Kennedy's Justice Department was trying to put in prison. Whether Robert Kennedy knew about the mob CIA connection is a question that has never been fully resolved. The available evidence suggests he may not have known the specifics, though this strains credibility given his oversight role in Mongoose. What is clear is that the collaboration existed and that it operated within the broader framework of a program he was directly responsible for. None of the assassination attempts succeeded. Castro's survival through this period is sometimes attributed to luck and sometimes to competence. His intelligence services were apparently quite effective at identifying and neutralizing threats, and probably it was both. But the attempts continued repeatedly over a period of years, with a persistence that suggests the pressure to produce results never really abated. Alongside Mongoose, other programs were operating that shared its basic character, if not always its direct lineage. Psychological operations aimed at the Cuban population were ongoing radio broadcasts, leaflets, efforts to undermine confidence in the Castro government. These were standard Cold War tools and less ethically fraught than the assassination attempts, but they were part of the same general effort to destabilize a government through means short of open military action. There were also operations that involved a degree of deception, not entirely unlike what Northwoods had proposed, though more limited in scope. Efforts to make it appear that internal Cuban opposition was stronger than it was. Efforts to create the impression of dissent within the Cuban military. Information operations designed to confuse and mislead Cuban intelligence about the nature and extent of American activities. The line between these approved operations and the rejected Northwoods proposals is real, but it is not always as clear as the fact of the rejection might suggest. The difference was largely one of degree, and of target. Northwoods had proposed deceiving the American public directly, staging events that would manipulate domestic opinion through manufactured grief and fear. The approved operations were mostly aimed outward, at Cuba, at international audiences, at the Cuban population. But the underlying logic that deception was a legitimate instrument of policy, that manufactured realities could serve strategic purposes, was shared. This matters because it complicates the narrative in which McNamara's rejection of Northwoods represents a clear moral line. The line was real, but it was drawn in a specific place, for specific reasons, and the territory on either side of it was not as different as the line's existence might imply. The Cuban Missile Crisis arrived in October of 1962, 7 months after Northwoods was rejected. For 13 days, the world sat closer to nuclear war than it has before or since, at least as far as the public record shows. Soviet missiles in Cuba, American naval blockade, back-channel negotiations, the real possibility that a miscalculation by either side would produce consequences that couldn't be undone. The crisis was resolved through diplomacy, a fact that still carries a kind of quiet weight when you consider how differently it might have gone. Kennedy agreed secretly to remove American missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. The public version of the resolution emphasized American firmness and Soviet retreat. The private version was more mutual than that. In the aftermath of the missile crisis, the most extreme pressure around Cuba began to ease. Not immediately, and not completely, but the trajectory shifted. The sense that Cuba represented an existential and immediate threat, the anxiety that had made Northwoods conceivable, diminished as the immediate danger passed. Mongoose was scaled back and eventually shut down. The assassination attempts continued for a while, then gradually wound down. Cuba remained a source of friction, but the acute phase of the obsession began to subside. What didn't subside was the broader set of practices and assumptions that Mongoose and its related programs had normalized. The idea that the CIA could conduct assassination programs, the idea that the government could run large-scale covert operations involving organized crime, the idea that the executive branch could authorize significant actions with real consequences for real people, without meaningful congressional oversight or public knowledge. These practices and assumptions didn't end with Cuba. They migrated. They became part of the institutional inheritance that shaped American foreign policy through the 1960s and beyond. Vietnam, Chile, Iran, a long sequence of interventions and covert actions that drew on the same basic toolkit, the same basic reasoning, the same basic conviction that certain ends justified certain means. The Senate investigations of the 1970s, the Church Committee for Intelligence Matters, the Pike Committee in the House attempted to map this territory and establish some accountability. They produced important public records. They resulted in some reforms, some new oversight structures, some limits on what the intelligence agencies could do without authorization. Whether those reforms fundamentally changed the underlying culture is a question that people who study these institutions continue to debate. The reforms were real, but cultures are more durable than rules, and the assumptions that made Northwoods conceivable about deception, about acceptable cost, about the relationship between the government and the people it was supposed to serve don't disappear simply because oversight structures are improved. There's a line that runs from Northwoods through Mongoose, through the programs that followed, not because each operation directly caused the next, but because they were all expressions of the same institutional logic operating in the same institutional environment. Each one approved, or nearly approved, or approved in a modified form, represented a small movement in the same direction toward a conception of government action in which the population being governed was treated not as the principal whose interests were paramount, but as an audience whose perceptions needed to be managed. That conception didn't originate in 1962, and it didn't end when Mongoose was shut down. It continued in various forms through various programs, some of which are still classified, and some of which will likely never be fully known. Northwoods is the document that surfaced. It is not necessarily the most extreme thing that was considered. It is simply the one we can read. Something about the way secrets age is worth thinking about. There's an assumption, when we talk about government secrets, that the keeping of them requires constant active effort, that somewhere there are people whose job it is to maintain the silence, watching, managing, suppressing, that the cover-up is an ongoing operation, sustained by intention and energy, and the continuous application of will. Sometimes that's true, but with Northwoods, something different happened, something quieter, and in some ways more instructive. The document wasn't aggressively hidden. It wasn't destroyed. No elaborate cover-up apparatus was constructed around it. It was filed. It went into the bureaucratic systems that process and store the enormous volume of paper that governments generate, and it stayed there. And for approximately 30 years, almost nobody looked for it. Not because they were prevented from looking, but because they didn't know to look, or didn't think to look, or looked elsewhere. The silence around Northwoods was largely a silence of indifference, an institutional forgetting, rather than active suppression. And that, when you sit with it, is almost more troubling than a dramatic cover-up would have been. A cover-up implies that someone knew the document existed and considered it dangerous enough to warrant concealment. What actually happened implies something different, that a proposal to stage attacks on American citizens was drafted, rejected, filed, and then simply not thought about again by the people who had been involved in it. It became administrative sediment, part of the geological record of a particular institution at a particular moment. Present, technically accessible through proper declassification procedures if anyone requested it, but effectively invisible because invisibility was its natural state. To understand how this happened, it helps to understand something about the volume of classified material the American government produces. The numbers, even in the early 1960s, were staggering. Millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of classification decisions every year, material stamped secret or top secret or eyes only, filed in systems that were not always well organized, stored in archives that were not always well indexed, maintained by bureaucracies that were not always well coordinated with each other. In that environment, a document doesn't need to be actively hidden to remain effectively hidden. It just needs to be one piece of paper among millions. It needs to sit in a folder, in a cabinet, in a building in Washington, classified at a level that requires clearance to access, in a filing system that doesn't advertise its contents. Given those conditions, a document can remain effectively unknown for decades without anyone making a single conscious decision to keep it that way. This is not a reassuring fact about government transparency. If anything, it's the opposite. The implication is that the classified archive contains not just secrets that are being actively protected, but secrets that have simply been forgotten material that was sensitive enough to classify, but not important enough to anyone currently in government to actively manage, documents that could be significant if found, but won't be found unless someone already knows to look. The Northwoods document fits this profile almost perfectly. After the rejection in 1962, the immediate principles moved on. Kennedy's attention turned to Vietnam, to the Soviet Union, to the thousand pressures of the presidency. Lemnitzer went to NATO. McNamara stayed at defense, but was consumed by the escalating situation in Southeast Asia. The Cuba obsession, while it didn't disappear entirely, began to recede as other crises crowded it out. The people who had drafted the proposal, the staff officers and planners who had actually sat down and written the specific language, who had thought through the operational details of drone aircraft and fake passenger lists and staged bombings, these people went on to other assignments, other projects, other documents, whatever they thought privately about what they had helped create. None of them talked about it publicly. The institutional culture around this kind of silence is worth understanding. Military and intelligence organizations operate within strong norms of confidentiality, norms that are partly practical and partly cultural. Talking about classified work outside authorized channels is not just prohibited, but genuinely understood as a form of betrayal within these communities. The silence isn't just enforced from outside, it's internalized. People who spend careers in these environments develop a deep habitual reticence about their work that doesn't easily dissolve even after they leave, even after decades have passed. This means that even people who had direct knowledge of Northwoods, who had read it, discussed it, contributed to it, were unlikely to mention it in retirement, unlikely to include it in memoirs, unlikely to tell stories about it at dinner parties. Not because they had been specifically instructed to maintain silence about this particular document, but because silence about this kind of work was simply the default posture of the world they had inhabited. The 1960s moved quickly and violently. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. The Warren Commission investigation followed. Vietnam escalated dramatically through 1,964 and 1,965, consuming institutional attention and public concern in ways that made Cuba seem relatively distant. The civil rights movement, urban unrest, political assassinations, Robert Kennedy in 1968, Martin Luther King in 1968, the decade produced so much trauma and disruption that the specific anxieties of 1,962 were buried under layers of subsequent history. The people who might have thought back to Northwoods in this period had other things to think about, and the document stayed where it was. The 1970s brought the Church Committee and the Pike Committee. The congressional investigations into intelligence community abuses that produced significant public revelations about assassination plots, domestic surveillance, and other programs. These investigations were important. They surfaced significant material, but they operated under time pressure with limited resources, and they couldn't examine everything. The church committee's focus on assassination plots led it to certain documents and certain witnesses. Northwoods, apparently, wasn't among the material it examined closely, or if it was examined it wasn't highlighted in the final reports. This is another mechanism of the 30-year silence, not just institutional forgetting, but the specific priorities of the people doing the investigating. Even serious, well-resourced investigations don't find everything. They follow threads. They pursue what seems most significant given what they already know. If Northwoods wasn't a thread anyone was following, it would remain where it was. The 1980s passed without the document surfacing. The Reagan administration was not a period of aggressive declassification of Cold War-era material. The general posture toward the intelligence community and the national security apparatus during this period was one of restoration and support rather than scrutiny. Whatever momentum toward transparency had been generated by the church committee era dissipated considerably. And through all of this, through 2 decades of American history, after the proposal was rejected, the document sat, classified, filed, part of a vast archive that no one was systematically examining in a political environment that wasn't particularly interested in examining it. The mechanism of the silence, then, was largely this: classification, combined with volume, combined with the absence of anyone, with the knowledge and motivation to specifically request this material. It's a mundane explanation for something that seems like it should have a more dramatic one. But mundane explanations are often the accurate one. There's something worth sitting with in the human dimension of this silence as well. The men who signed Northwood's Lemnitzer and the other Joint Chiefs lived for years after 1962 as public figures. They gave speeches, they attended ceremonies, they were interviewed. Lemnitzer remained active in various advisory and ceremonial capacities well into the 1970s. He died in 1988, 4 years before the document that bore his signature became public. He never addressed it, not once, in any public forum. What was it like, carrying that? Not the guilt of it. We don't know enough about his inner life to assume guilt was present. But the simple practical fact of having signed a document proposing what Northwoods proposed, and then living for 26 years in a world where that document existed somewhere in an archive, where it could in principle surface at any time, where the question of what would happen if it did must have at least occasionally presented itself. Did he think about it? Did he consider it a minor episode, one rejected proposal among many in a long career? Did he believe, as the decades passed, that it was safely buried? Did he ever imagine it being read by people who would find it as disturbing as most people do? There are no answers to these questions. The record is silent on his inner experience of this particular silence. What the record does show is that the silence held for almost exactly 30 years. From March of 1962, when the proposal was submitted and rejected, to the early 1990s, when the conditions finally changed enough that the document could surface. Those conditions, the end of the Cold War, a specific piece of legislation, a specific investigation into a specific assassination, are what brought Northwoods out of the archive and into the world. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, it's worth staying here, in the 30-year quiet, in the space between a proposal being made and a proposal being known, in the gap between what governments do and what the people governed by them are permitted to understand. That gap is not unique to this document. It exists in various forms around various decisions in every government that has ever operated at significant scale. Most of what fills that gap is probably mundane administrative decisions, policy discussions, the routine machinery of governance that doesn't require public knowledge to function. But some of it is not mundane, some of it is Northwoods, and the question that the 30-year silence raises, quietly, is not just about what was hidden in the past, it's about what is sitting, right now, in archives that haven't been examined yet, in filing systems that haven't been searched, in documents that are classified at levels that require clearance to access, in buildings where nobody is currently looking. The answer, almost certainly, is more than we know. How much more is the part nobody can tell you? The end of the Cold War changed something fundamental about the relationship between the American government and its own history. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a quiet shift occurred in the political calculus around classified material from the Cold War era. The justifications for keeping certain secrets had always rested, at least partly, on the argument that releasing them would damage ongoing operations, compromise sources, or hand advantages to adversaries. When the primary adversary ceased to exist in its previous form, some of those justifications became harder to sustain. The world had changed. The context in which the secrets had been created had changed, and the argument for continued secrecy became, in certain cases, more about institutional habit and self-protection than genuine national security. This shift didn't produce a sudden flood of declassification. Bureaucracies don't move that way. But it created conditions in which certain kinds of pressure for transparency could gain traction in ways they hadn't before. The specific mechanism that brought Northwoods to light was not primarily about Cuba or about the Joint Chiefs or about any of the direct content of the document itself. It came through a different door entirely through the Kennedy assassination. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. The legislation was prompted partly by the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK the previous year, which had generated enormous public controversy and renewed interest in questions about what the government knew and hadn't disclosed about the events of November 22, 1963. The film was polemical and in many respects historically unreliable, but it accomplished something significant. It moved the question of Kennedy assassination records from the domain of conspiracy theorists and researchers to a mainstream political issue. Congress responded with legislation. The act established the Assassination Records Review Board, an independent body charged with reviewing government documents related to the Kennedy assassination and determining which ones could be released to the public. The board's mandate was deliberately broad. It was authorized to examine material from the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, the military, and other agencies. It could compel agencies to produce documents. It had genuine authority, not just advisory status. The board began its work in 1994 and operated through 1998. In that period, it reviewed millions of pages of documents and released an enormous volume of material that had previously been classified. Much of this material was directly related to the Kennedy assassination, the investigation, the various agencies' records of their own activities in Dallas, and afterward, the surveillance records on Lee Harvey Oswald and his contacts. This was the primary focus. But the board's mandate extended to related material records of programs and operations that might have bearing on the assassination or its context. And in that broader sweep, Northwoods surfaced. The document was found and released as part of the board's declassification process. It entered the public record quietly, without a press conference or an announcement. It became available to researchers and journalists as part of a large volume of material being processed and released over the course of several years. The initial discovery and public attention around Northwoods is associated primarily with James Bamford, an investigative journalist and author who had spent years studying the National Security Agency and American intelligence programs. Bamford encountered the document in the released records and recognized its significance. He wrote about it in his 2001 book Body of Secrets, which examined the NSA but devoted considerable attention to Northwoods in the context of its broader argument about the American national security apparatus. Bamford's treatment of the document brought it to a wider audience. Before Body of Secrets, Northwoods was technically public. It had been released. It was in the archive. Researchers with sufficient knowledge and motivation could have found it, but it wasn't widely known. After Bamford's book, it became something that journalists, documentary makers, and researchers began to reference regularly. The public response to the document, when it did reach a broader audience, is interesting to examine. By 2001, when Body of Secrets was published, the information environment was different from anything that had existed during the Cold War. The internet existed. Information moved differently. A document like Northwoods could circulate in ways that weren't possible when the Church Committee had done its work in the 1970s. And yet the public response was, in a word, muted. There was coverage. Bamford's book received serious reviews and was discussed in mainstream media outlets. The document was reported on. ABC News ran a segment on it that described the proposals in plain terms and noted their extraordinary nature. But the coverage didn't produce the kind of sustained national conversation that the document's content might seem to warrant. Part of this was timing. Body of Secrets was published in early 2001. By September of that year, the events of September 11 had occurred, and the entire frame through which Americans were processing questions about national security, government deception, and institutional trustworthiness shifted dramatically. The immediate context became overwhelming. Questions about 1,962 receded even further than they had already receded. But timing alone doesn't fully explain the muted response. There's something else operating in the way the public received Northwoods that's worth thinking about carefully. The document required people to update something fairly fundamental about their understanding of their own government. Not just to learn that a bad thing had happened. Americans had learned plenty of bad things about their government by 2001, through Watergate, through the Church Committee, through Iran-Contra, through a long sequence of revelations about surveillance and covert action. The capacity for shock had been eroded. A certain baseline cynicism existed. But Northwoods asked for something specific. It asked people to sit with the documented fact that senior American military officials had formally proposed staging lethal attacks on American civilians, had written it down, signed their names, sent it through channels, and that this proposal had not resulted in meaningful accountability for those involved. That's a particular kind of uncomfortable knowledge. It doesn't fit neatly into the existing frameworks most people use to think about government wrongdoing. It's not corruption in the ordinary sense. Nobody was getting rich from Northwoods. It's not incompetence. The proposal was carefully thought through. It's something closer to a fundamental misalignment between the stated purpose of the institution and the values that were actually operating inside it. That kind of knowledge is hard to integrate. It doesn't produce a clear emotional response with a clear outlet. You can't vote it out of office. You can't prosecute anyone. The people involved were either dead or very old by the time the document surfaced. And in any case, the proposal was rejected and never carried out. There's no villain to punish and no victim to compensate. There's just the document and the knowledge and the question of what to do with it. Most people, presented with that situation, do what humans generally do with knowledge that's uncomfortable and actionless. They absorb it partially, file it somewhere in the back of their understanding of how the world works, and move on. Not because they don't care, but because caring without any available action is exhausting in a specific way that the mind tends to root around. This is not a criticism. It's a description of a very human response to a very human problem. The researchers and journalists who continued to work with the document after it surfaced have produced a reasonably thorough public record of what it contains and what it represents. It appears in academic histories of the Kennedy administration and the Cold War. It's referenced in serious works on American foreign policy and intelligence history. It's taught in some university courses on American government and national security. It has a legitimate place in the historical record. What it hasn't produced is a serious institutional reckoning. No commission was established to examine how the proposal came to be, what it revealed about the culture that produced it, or what structural changes might prevent similar proposals from being generated in the future. No formal statement was issued by the Defense Department or the Joint Chiefs acknowledging the document and its implications. No apology was offered to the American public for the fact that its own military had once formally proposed attacking it. The document was released, it was reported on, it was discussed. And then the institutions whose history it revealed continued operating, largely unchanged in their basic structure, without any formal engagement with what the document said about them. That response, or absence of response, is itself a form of information. It tells you something about the relationship between institutional transparency and institutional accountability. These are not the same thing. A government can release documents that reveal significant wrongdoing and simultaneously decline to treat those revelations as requiring any response beyond the release itself. Transparency without accountability is a particular kind of performance. It allows an institution to say, truthfully, that it disclosed the information. It does not require the institution to do anything about what the information reveals. Northwoods was disclosed, technically, completely, without redaction. The full text is available. Anyone can read it. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the institution whose predecessors drafted it, issued no statement about it, conducted no internal review of its implications, treated its release as a historical matter, a document from a different era, something that had been properly handled through the normal declassification process and required nothing further. That silence, following the document's release, rhymes in an uncomfortable way with the silence that preceded it. Different in character, but recognizably the same institution responding to the same document with the same basic posture. The archive released it, the institution absorbed it, the public processed it partially and moved on. And the document remained what it had always been, a plain, signed, bureaucratic record of something that was seriously proposed, quietly rejected, and then quietly forgotten by everyone except the people who went looking for it. There's a particular category of historical revelation that produces a strange doubling effect. You learn something that should change everything about how you understand a subject, and then you watch as almost nothing changes. The information exists. It's real. It's documented. And yet the world on the other side of that information looks remarkably similar to the world before it. Northwoods belongs to that category. In the years since the document became publicly known, it has accumulated a specific kind of presence in American culture. Not central, not marginal, but occupying a middle space that's hard to characterize precisely. It's well known enough that mentioning it in a conversation about government deception or Cold War history will produce recognition in many people. It's obscure enough that a significant portion of the population has never heard of it. It exists in the record, cited regularly in serious academic and journalistic work, and simultaneously fails to register as the kind of foundational revelation that permanently alters public understanding. Understanding why requires thinking about how information actually changes things or doesn't. The naive model of information and public understanding works something like this. A significant fact is revealed, people learn the fact, they update their understanding accordingly, and behavior or policy or institutional culture shifts in response. The revelation produces a change proportional to its significance. This model is largely wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. Information doesn't automatically translate into understanding, and understanding doesn't automatically translate into change. There are filters operating at every stage, psychological, cultural, political, institutional, that shape what information reaches people, how they process it, and what they do with it. With Northwoods, several of these filters operated simultaneously. The first is what might be called the prior belief filter. When people encounter information that contradicts their existing understanding of the world, they tend to process it through the lens of what they already believe. Someone who already held significant skepticism about government trustworthiness would absorb Northwoods as confirmation. It fit an existing framework and required no fundamental revision of worldview. Someone who held a more trusting view of institutions would tend to minimize it. It was historical. It was rejected. It was the product of a specific, extreme circumstance. It didn't represent anything systemic. Neither of these responses required actually sitting with the document's full implications. Both allowed the person to maintain their prior framework, essentially intact, modified at the edges, but not fundamentally revised. This pattern is not unique to Northwoods. It's how people generally process uncomfortable historical information. The document became, for different audiences, either evidence of how bad things already were, or a historical footnote that didn't require updating much of anything. The second filter is what might be called the actionability problem. Even people who absorbed Northwoods without minimizing it, who sat with its full implications and felt genuinely disturbed, faced a practical question. What do you do with this? The proposal was from 1962. The people who signed it were dead. The specific operation was never carried out. The immediate harm was zero. There was no villain currently in office to hold accountable, no ongoing program to stop, no specific policy to change. Information that produces disturbance without producing any clear action tends to be emotionally processed and then set aside. Not forgotten entirely, but not integrated into active engagement with the world either. It becomes part of a background understanding, a general awareness that things are more complicated and potentially darker than official narratives suggest without producing specific changed behavior. This is psychologically understandable. It may even be psychologically necessary. Human beings can't sustain high-level engagement with every disturbing fact they encounter. The mind develops ways of categorizing and filing things that allow functional life to continue. Northwoods gets filed in a category: government wrongdoing, Cold War excesses, things that happened before, and life moves on. The third filter is institutional inertia. Even if a significant number of people process Northwoods in a way that produced genuine concern and a desire for change, the institutions those people would need to change are not responsive to diffuse public concern about historical documents. They respond to organized political pressure, to specific legislative proposals, to crises that demand immediate response. A document revealing that something terrible was proposed and rejected 60 years ago doesn't create that kind of pressure, even if it arguably should. The Defense Department didn't change its internal culture in response to Northwoods becoming public. The Joint Chiefs didn't issue guidance about the kinds of proposals that are never acceptable to draft, regardless of strategic pressure. There was no internal investigation, no Inspector General's report, no formal acknowledgement that the document represented something that required institutional self-examination. This isn't surprising. Institutions don't typically volunteer self-examination in response to historical revelations unless they're compelled to, and in this case no compulsion arrived. What Northwoods did change, more subtly, is something in the texture of public discourse about government deception. Before the document became widely known, certain kinds of claims about what governments were capable of proposing were treated as inherently implausible, as the province of paranoia, of conspiracy thinking, of people who couldn't be trusted to assess reality clearly. The existence of Northwoods made at least some of those claims harder to dismiss categorically. This is a genuine change, even if it's difficult to measure. It shifted, slightly, the burden of proof in conversations about institutional behavior. When someone argues that a government might consider staging a violent incident to justify a policy goal, the appropriate response is no longer simple dismissal. The documented fact that this was formally proposed at the highest levels of the American military means that the conversation has to engage with the specifics, with the evidence for or against a particular claim, rather than treating the category of claim as inherently incredible. That's a modest but real change in the epistemic environment. It has also, less helpfully, provided material for people who want to argue for things that aren't supported by the evidence. Northwoods gets cited in contexts where its relevance is questionable, used as a stepping stone from documented history to undocumented speculation. The logic runs, if they were willing to consider Northwoods, they were willing to consider anything. Therefore, whatever I'm claiming they did is plausible. This logic doesn't hold. The existence of one documented proposal doesn't establish the plausibility of all possible proposals. The specific circumstances, the specific pressures, the specific people involved in 1962 were what they were. Northwoods tells us something about what was possible in that specific context. It doesn't tell us that everything is possible in every context. But the document has been used that way repeatedly. It appears in discussions of events where it has no direct relevance, invoked as a general license for suspicion, rather than as a specific historical fact with specific implications. This has had the secondary effect of associating Northwoods, in some contexts, with the broader world of conspiracy thinking, which in turn makes it easier for people who want to minimize the document to dismiss engagement with it as conspiratorial rather than historical. This is a familiar dynamic. Genuine historical revelations about government wrongdoing often get absorbed into the broader ecosystem of conspiracy culture, and that absorption makes them easier to dismiss by association. It's an uncomfortable irony. The document's significance is in some ways undermined by the attention it receives from people who use it irresponsibly. What remains, when you strip away both the minimizers and the overreachers, is the plain content of the document and the plain implications of its existence. The plain content is what it is, a formal proposal from the highest levels of the American military to stage violent attacks on American citizens and interests in order to manufacture justification for a military operation. The proposal was rejected. The rejection mattered, but the proposal exists. The plain implications are several. That institutions under pressure can generate proposals that violate the most basic principles of the relationship between government and governed. That the culture of an institution shapes what can be proposed within it, and that cultures can drift far from their stated values under sufficient pressure. That rejection of a specific proposal doesn't resolve the underlying conditions that made it possible. That the public record of government action is incomplete in ways that are difficult to quantify, that what we know represents a fraction of what occurred, and that fraction was selected partly by chance and partly by the specific mechanisms of declassification that happen to surface certain material. These implications don't require conspiracy thinking. They don't require believing that Northwoods was part of a broader pattern of specific similar operations. They follow directly from the documented facts. The question of whether those implications have been adequately integrated into how Americans understand their government is harder to answer. There are people who have integrated them thoroughly: historians, researchers, journalists, citizens who have spent time with the material. There are people who haven't integrated them at all, who've never heard of the document, or who've dismissed it as a historical curiosity. And there is a large middle group who know about it in a general way, who hold it somewhere in their background, understanding, who would cite it if pressed as evidence that governments sometimes do or consider extraordinary things, but who haven't let it significantly alter their relationship to the institutions it describes. That middle group is probably the most honest response to what Northwoods offers. Not certainty, not paralysis, not the abandonment of all trust in institutions, just a revision, quiet, permanent, slightly uncomfortable, of what institutions are capable of when the conditions are right. The conditions that produced Northwoods were specific. They were also not unique to 1962. Pressure, failure, institutional culture, the conviction that certain goals justify extraordinary means these conditions recur. They're recurring somewhere right now, in some institution, in some part of the world. Whether they're producing proposals similar to Northwoods, somewhere in a filing system that hasn't been examined yet, is a question the public record cannot answer. That's not a comfortable place to end up, but it's an honest one. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is probably the most useful thing a historical document like Northwoods can offer. Not conclusions, not certainty, not a clear map of what was done and who was responsible and what should happen next. Just the plain fact of what was written down by real people in a real institution, in a real moment of history. And the invitation to sit with what that means. Some things don't resolve. That sounds like a simple observation, maybe even an obvious one. But there's a specific kind of resistance in the mind to accepting it, a pull toward closure, toward the satisfying shape of a story that ends somewhere definitive. We want the document to mean something clear. We want the story to arrive somewhere. We want the discomfort to have a purpose, to point towards something actionable, to become useful in a way that justifies having felt it. Northwoods doesn't offer that, and the longer you spend with it, the more that refusal to resolve feels like the most honest thing about it. What remains, after everything, after the context and the signatures and the proposals and the rejection and the silence and the surfacing and the muted response, is something quieter than a conclusion. It's closer to a permanent revision of a certain kind of assumption, not a dramatic revision, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that settles in slowly, over time, and changes the texture of how you hold certain ideas without changing the surface of how you present them. The assumption that gets revised is something like this: that the institutions built to protect people are, at their core, oriented toward that protection. That whatever failures and excesses occur at the margins, there is a center that holds a fundamental alignment between what the institution says it is and what it actually does when the pressure is high and the oversight is thin. Northwoods doesn't destroy that assumption entirely. It would be too simple to say it does. One document isn't the whole of anything, and the institutions of American government have, across their history, done real things to protect real people in real circumstances. The picture is complicated and should be held as complicated, but the document does something specific to that assumption. It introduces a permanent uncertainty, a quiet awareness that the alignment between stated purpose and actual behavior is not guaranteed, that it can drift, under the right conditions, further than most people would find comfortable to accept, and that the drift can happen through normal bureaucratic processes, through normal institutional channels, through the work of people who believe they are being professional and responsible and serving the national interest. That uncertainty is not the same as cynicism. Cynicism would say the institutions are corrupt at their core, the stated values were always a performance, nothing can be trusted. That's a different and less accurate claim than what Northwoods actually supports. What Northwoods supports is something more specific and more nuanced. It supports the claim that institutions are capable of extraordinary drift under extraordinary pressure, and that the mechanisms designed to prevent that drift are not always sufficient, and that the record of what actually occurs inside institutions is incomplete in ways that should generate appropriate humility about confident claims regarding what governments are and aren't capable of. That's a modest conclusion by the standards of dramatic revelation, but it's a real one, and it's durable in a way that more dramatic conclusions often aren't. There's a specific question that Northwoods raises that tends to persist even after you've absorbed the document's content and context. It's not about 1962. It's not about Cuba, or the Joint Chiefs, or Robert McNamara. It's about now, in the broadest sense, about the present, about the institutions currently operating, about the classified archive currently accumulating. The question is simply, what else is there? Not in a paranoid sense, not with the assumption that whatever else is there must be as dramatic as Northwoods or more so, just in the plain, honest sense that follows from what the document's history teaches about how institutional secrets work. Northwoods existed for 30 years without being publicly known. It was technically accessible, classified, but present, in an archive, retrievable through proper processes. It wasn't actively hidden. It just sat there, waiting, in the vast accumulation of government paper that nobody was systematically examining. The mechanisms that kept it invisible for 3 decades, classification, volume, the absence of anyone with the specific knowledge and motivation to request it, those mechanisms still exist. The classified archive is larger now than it was in 1992 when Northwoods was released. The volume of classified material produced by the American government has grown significantly since the Cold War ended, not shrunk. The processes of declassification are slow, incomplete, and shaped by the priorities of the people managing them, which means that somewhere in that archive, with near certainty, there are documents that will produce in future readers something like what Northwoods produces in readers now. Not necessarily similar in content, not necessarily proposals to stage false flag operations or manufacture pretexts for war, but documents that reveal something about the gap between what institutions say and what they do, between their stated values and their actual behavior under pressure, between the public record and the full record. Some of those documents will be released eventually, through the slow machinery of declassification and freedom of information requests, and specific legislative mandates, like the one that released Northwoods. Some will remain classified for longer than any currently living person will be around to read them. Some may be destroyed quietly, through processes that are themselves not well documented. The incompleteness of the record is permanent, not temporary, not something that will be resolved with sufficient time and sufficient transparency. Permanent, in the sense that every government at scale produces more decisions than it documents, and documents more than it ever releases, and releases more than most people ever read. The full picture is not available, and will never be available. This is not a counsel of despair. It's a description of reality that, once accepted, actually makes it easier to think clearly about these questions. If you expect the full picture, The incompleteness feels like a failure, like something is being hidden from you specifically. If you accept the incompleteness as structural, as a feature of institutions at scale, not a conspiracy against understanding, you can work with what you have more honestly. What you have includes Northwoods, a real document, fully available, thoroughly documented, describing a real proposal made by real people in a real institution at a real moment in history. It doesn't require embellishment. It doesn't require connecting it to other events through chains of speculation. It stands on its own as a piece of evidence about what institutions are capable of, and that evidence is significant. The most important thing Northwoods teaches may not be about the specific proposals it contained. Those proposals were rejected, and the circumstances that produced them were specific to a particular moment and a particular set of pressures. The most important thing may be about the process, about how a proposal like this moves through a bureaucracy, about how it gets drafted and signed and submitted through normal channels without anyone in that process apparently experiencing it as a fundamental violation of what their institution stood for. Because if the process is the thing to understand, then the question isn't just about what was proposed in 1962. The question is about what processes currently exist in current institutions under current pressures. What gets drafted? What gets signed? What moves through channels? What sits in inboxes and conference rooms and secure facilities, described in the careful, professional, measured language of people who believe they are solving problems? Most of it is probably mundane. Most of what any large institution produces is mundane. The extraordinary cases are extraordinary precisely because they're rare, because the normal functioning of institutions doesn't produce Northwoods every week or every year. But rare is not the same as impossible. And impossible is not the same as unthinkable. Northwoods was clearly thinkable, because someone thought it, and wrote it down, and sent it to the Secretary of Defense. The question of what is currently thinkable inside current institutions, under current pressures, is not one that the public record can answer. By definition, the most sensitive proposals are the least visible. The things most worth knowing are the things most carefully controlled. This is where Northwoods leaves you, if you follow it honestly to its end. Not with answers, not with a map, not with certainty about what was done, or what is being done, or what might be done, but with a specific, permanent, calibrated awareness that the institutions human beings build to organize power are not reliably aligned with the values they claim to represent, and that the gaps between those things are real and significant and incompletely documented. That awareness is uncomfortable. It should be. It would be more comfortable to know that the rejection of Northwoods was the system working as designed, that the safeguards held because the safeguards were robust, that the culture that produced the proposal was anomalous and has since been corrected. It would be more comfortable to believe that the 30-year silence was the last such silence, that the archive has been examined thoroughly, that what has been released represents the full picture. None of those comfortable beliefs are supported by the evidence. What is supported is something more modest and more honest. The system has safeguards. The safeguards sometimes work. The rejection of Northwoods was real and mattered. And simultaneously, the conditions that produced Northwoods were not unique to 1962. The archive is not fully examined, and the record is not complete. Both things are true. They don't cancel each other out. They exist together, in tension, as the most accurate description of what the document and its history actually tell us. There is one last thing worth sitting with before this ends. Somewhere in the National Archives, the original Northwoods document exists as a physical object. Paper, ink, signatures, the actual pages that moved through actual hands in 1962. That physical object has outlasted everyone who touched it. The drafters, the signers, the people who reviewed it and rejected it, the people who filed it and forgot about it. It outlasted the Cold War that gave rise to it. It outlasted most of the institutions and rivalries and anxieties that made it conceivable. It is still there, quiet, available, part of the permanent record. Documents don't forget. They don't rationalize or minimize or move on. They just hold what was put into them, exactly as it was put in, waiting for whoever comes next. Northwoods will be read by people who haven't been born yet. It will be read in contexts we can't currently imagine, in a world shaped by events that haven't happened. and those future readers will encounter the same flat, professional, bureaucratic language describing the same proposals, and they will have to decide, as every reader has had to decide, what to do with that knowledge, what to do with the fact that serious people, in a real institution, once sat down and wrote this, what to do with the fact that it was rejected, and filed, and forgotten, and found, what to do with the question it leaves behind, not about 1962, but about the nature of institutions and power and the relationship between those who govern and those who are governed, and the permanent, unresolvable uncertainty about what is happening in the spaces we cannot see. That question doesn't have an answer. It just has to be carried. And carrying it honestly without collapsing into either easy trust or easy cynicism is probably the most useful thing any of us can do with what this document offers. It's a strange kind of gift, an uncomfortable one, from a filing cabinet in Washington to anyone willing to sit with what it says. The rain is still falling outside, the dark is still quiet, and somewhere in an archive, the paper is still there.